Hey everyone, Dr. Becker here. Welcome to Chapter 10 is one of the longer chapters. It's about the heart. So we cover cardiac and we cover both the mechanical functions of the heart and the electrical functions of the heart. So it is a long chapter. It has a ton of detail in it. The PowerPoints are actually divided up into 3. So that can tell you that there's a lot of information here. What I'd like to do is I'm going to incorporate a few of the osmosis videos in this as we talk together. And I think that that might really help us tie them all together with the book the best. There's just so much information in the cardiac chapters. So let's get to it, and I will try to make sure when I post them to let you know which ones I've added in here to watch as well. I do feel like through quite a bit of the book, it marries pretty well with being able to watch the osmosis videos independently and tying them together. But I feel like for the cardiac, especially the electrical system, we would be better off doing it that way. So these are the key concepts that they want us to understand and talk about, that we would have spontaneous electrical activity that's generated in the heart, that keeps us in a regular rate and rhythm of our contractions and our heart rate. That we'll review that the normal sinus rhythm should start in the sinoatrial node pacemaker, and then will be propagated through the conduction pathways. The muscle contraction follows electrical activation. The atria should come before the ventricles, and the ventricles, what they eject will be the stroke volume into the aorta, into the pulmonary artery. And then cardiac output is something we talk about as well. These are the different disorders that your book highlights as ones we should know. As you can see, there's a lot of them. Like, these aren't just 1 or 2 or 3. There's quite a few electrical disorders. I'd say in practice, you're definitely going to see your atrial fib and atrial flutter. You might see, depending on where you work, what nature that specialty you may find yourself in. You may see, like if you're in cardiology, you're going to see some of the blocks, some Brugada, some sick sinus syndrome. But things like the reentry tachycardias, the hopefully the VTAC, those things, and the AV reentrant, the Wolff-Parkinson-White, those are a little less common, but we still need to know about what they are. So like I said, lots of information in here. It continues on into the different mixed mechanical disorders of the heart that are listed here. And then we have some of the congenital disorders of the heart that we would talk about as well. First things first, I do think it's very helpful to tie in chapters 9 and 10 together, 8, 9, 10, really. In chapter 8, we started learning about the blood, the components of the blood, and how the blood works in our body for anemia and for clotting, mainly. And then in chapter 9, we talk about the circulatory system for the cardiovascular, so the vascular circulatory system. And that introduced us to atherosclerosis in a much more detailed way, which comes up again when we talk about heart and heart function. And so intentionally, the book then takes us into chapter 10 so that we can begin to tie those 3 things together. When you talk about what is the function of the heart, right? If I were explaining it to a kindergartner, I'd say, well, it pumps our blood throughout our body. If I was going to explain it maybe to an 8th or 9th grade biology class, what's a little bit more of a definition we could give? Maybe we would say that the function of the heart serves 3 things. The primary function of the heart is to generate the pressures that drive the blood flow through the vascular system, both to the lungs and the organs and all of our tissues. The heart requires an electrical impulse generated by our pacemaker cells at regular intervals, propagated through the heart in a synchronous rhythm. And we have contractile cells of the heart that respond to this excitation by generating pressure and ejecting a volume of blood that goes into the pulmonary and the circulatory systems. right? So that's one way to look at the heart for sure. If we were to review the vascular system through the body, we would remember that typically, if we talk about it, we would say that if we had blood pour into the right atrium, the blood then goes down in through the tricuspid valve with the three parts there and goes into the right ventricle. Then it goes out the, what is this bad boy? Pulmonary valve, which is a semilunar valve, and it goes out the pulmonary arteries, which divides into the left and right pulmonary arteries. That then goes into the circulation of the lungs, and then it is going to be returned, right, back in through here into the left atrium. Then it goes through the mitral valve, the left ventricle, and then it's going to come out of our aorta and then circulate throughout the entire body down through the capillaries, where then it goes into the venules, which comes back into the venous system, which is going to pour back into the inferior vena cava, which then pours back into the right atrium. Remember that we also have coming off of our aorta pulmonary veins to take the blood back and forth from the lungs, and we also feed back into the cardiac tissue itself. So with each and every heartbeat, we have to have a synchronous, organized rate and rhythm, and we use the words diastole and systole. So let's take a brief second just to review what those are. When we talk about diastole, what we're referring to is the resting state in which time that these ventricles are at their fullest because they have been allowed to stretch. So it's the end of the stretch. Systole then is an active state of contraction where the blood is being ejected into the vascular system. We call our cardiac output our heart rate times our stroke volume. So the amount of blood that fills into the ventricle that is ejected out is our stroke volume. We take that times our heart rate, and that's our cardiac output. Cardiac output in an adult male is about 5 liters per minute. So an adult female, about 4 liters per minute. It can go all the way up to 8. The heart can support our strenuous activity, though, because we can increase our heart rate and our stroke volume and significantly increase our cardiac output 4 to 5 times its normal. I like that your book describes it that the heart is actually 2 pumps in 1 organ. And I think that's a really helpful way to look at it, to remember that you actually have 2 separate pumps. And I'm weird with my analogies, and I like to think of it as they're connected via a radio tower, signaling each other and communicating, but they're 2 unique pumps, but they have to work in concert and work together. We know that we have 4 chambers of our heart. We have 2 aorta, or 2 atria, 2 ventricles. We know that each atrium is going to be connected to the ventricle by a valve. We call these the AV valves, atrioventricular valve. The tricuspid valve connects the right to the right, and the bicuspid, or the mitral valve, connects the left to the left. Remember then, if we have these 2 separate parts, that we have the right side of the heart is feeding the pulmonary circuit, and the left side of the heart is facilitating and supplying the systemic circuit. Oftentimes, when we think about the right side of the heart, we can think of this as the non-oxygenated part of the heart, and the left is what handles the oxygenated part of the heart. Remember that the definition typically of an artery is something that carries oxygenated blood. This is the only time in the body where that is not true. Our pulmonary artery is the only time we have blood in our system that's not oxygenated blood traveling through an artery, because it's actually carrying it away from the heart. So it is an artery, but it's actually deoxygenated blood. Next thing to talk about when we're talking about the structures of the heart is talking then about the pericardium. So the heart and its connections with the major vessels, which is an important part to remember, is then surrounded by our pericardial sac. The pericardial sac consists of the two distinct layers that we can see in here. So in that we have the tough outer fibrous, which is our pericardium, right? So we have our pericardium here, and then the inner serous pericardium. Okay, the inner serous pericardium then has a two layers in and of itself. So these two layers here are the inner pericardium. So we have the pericardial cavity, and then we have the epicardium, which is the visceral layer of the serous. And then we have this parietal layer of the serous. And then in the middle should be this cavity for our fluid. And then we have the myocardium, which is the actual heart tissue. And then we have the endocardium, which is the layer that actually is the inside layer of the ventricle or the muscle tissue. This fibrous, this pericardial cavity is where our pericardial fluid should be. It should be a very scant amount that allows for really a lubrication, if you will, so that you can have the heart beating and expanding and not get any friction rub. So if you hear a friction rub, that's abnormal. If you have too much fluid in that, you're going to have a problem because that would be causing a pericardial effusion that can cause a cardiac tamponade. Also, the issue could be if the pericardium becomes too thick, then that also is going to encroach on the size of the ventricle, and you could get a constrictive pericarditis. So the pericardium is another part of the heart structure, if you will. That's important to understand how that's working so that you would understand a physiology if something occurred with that. The other thing to understand about the structure then of the heart wall, so this part of this here, which is our heart muscle, and what does this all look like, right? Although the myocardium is the dominant layer of our cardiac wall, its thickness is going to vary greatly, right? So as this picture depicts here, our left ventricle, as the wall, is going to be considerably thicker than the right ventricle. And the reason for that is that the left has to create higher pressures to overcome the vascular resistance. So this muscle has to be very strong to force the blood up out of the aorta into our vascular system. Okay, whereas the right ventricle is going to encounter much lower pulse pressures into the pulmonary system. So typically, this muscle here has to generate about 120 millimeters of mercury, or the average systolic blood pressure is what this muscle has to generate. But this muscle over here typically only has to generate about 25 millimeters of mercury to overcome the resistance of the lungs. This one here is now when we start to talk about the overview of the myocardial cell structure. So I'm going to pause and I'm going to tie in our osmosis videos here because they do a phenomenal job of explaining this much more clearly than I would, and their illustrations are really important. So at this point, this is the cardiac contractility video that's listed in your list. This is going to begin to tie in a lot of different ideas, but it starts talking about the contractility and these things. So like I said, this video kind of ties it in a different pattern than what is in the text. So let's listen to this together. Turn up the speed a little bit.
The main job of the heart is to pump blood all over the body to our organs and tissues and keep them oxygenated. It does so by contracting around 70 times per minute. The physiological basis of cardiac contractility is the synchronous contraction of heart muscle cells, aka cardiomyocytes. Cardiac contractility is a measure of the strength of cardiomyocytes to contract. In order for cardiomyocytes to contract, they first need to depolarize. Depolarization is when ions move across the membrane of a cell and the membrane potential becomes less negative or even slightly positive. Think of a really pessimistic negative cell throwing his hands up and enjoying a moment of joy. When one cell depolarizes enough, it can cause some ions, like calcium, to flow into neighboring cells and trigger them to depolarize as well. If one cell after another depolarizes, then there's a depolarization wave, which you can imagine would look like a wave moving through a crowd at a football stadium. Each depolarization wave causes a heart muscle contraction, so the rate at which depolarization waves ripple through the heart actually sets the heart rate. This depolarization wave starts with the sinoatrial node, which sometimes gets called the SA node, and then moves through the rest of the heart to cause a contraction. So if depolarization waves are going through about once per second, that means that your heart beats once per second, or 60 times in a minute. Now, let's zoom in on a cardiomyocyte. These hardworking cells have branches and intercalated discs along their edges, which have small holes called gap junctions that allow ions to flow from one cardiomyocyte to the next. When ions like calcium move from that cell into a neighboring cell, this triggers depolarization, and cardiomyocytes depolarize one after the other. Another feature of cardiomyocytes are passageways called transverse tubules, or T-tubules. T-tubules are invaginations, or tunnels of the cardiomyocyte membrane, that increase the surface area of the cardiomyocyte, and they look like the letter T, so it's easy to remember their name. One last important element to depolarization and contraction is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is an organelle that stores the intracellular calcium. When a depolarization wavefront hits a cardiomyocyte, a few calcium ions flow through gap junctions. Looking at the cell membrane, if a threshold membrane potential is reached, then sodium channels start to open up. If there's a depolarization, then calcium and sodium ions start to move across the cell membrane and into the cell. That's where the T-tubules play a key role by bringing calcium deep into the cell. Once this extracellular calcium gets inside, it binds to the ryanodine receptors on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which releases even more calcium into the cell, a process called calcium-induced calcium release. This process helps to activate two contractile proteins, actin and myosin, which are called myofilaments. Myosin is able to attach and pull actin with the help of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, to form cross bridges that result in shortening of the muscle fiber. Eventually, calcium ions are removed by ion transporters that rely on ATP or concentration gradients. Now that we understand how a cardiomyocyte contracts, we can look at the various factors that affect cardiomyocyte contractility. Contractility is directly related to the concentration of calcium within the cardiomyocyte, so any factors that increase intracellular calcium levels will increase cardiac contractility. Since calcium is stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, concentrations of calcium will vary with how much calcium there is intracellularly and how much calcium is stored within the sarcoplasmic reticulum that is available to be released. One of the main methods intracellular calcium can be changed is with the autonomic nervous system. The heart.
Pause there for just a minute and go back to the book lecture. So in your book, what they point out here, this is figure 10.4. This is showing us that the myocardial cells are relatively short and cylindrical and are connected by a specialized portion of the plasma membrane called the intercalated discs. Their cytoplasm has abundant myofilaments, which we talked about on the video, consisting of actin and myosin, which are proteins arranged in the sarcomeres. The cardiac cell-to-cell junctions at the intercalated discs include the desmosomes that are mechanical links between the cells and the gap junctions that are electrical links between the cells. So in the book, it does talk about that the cardiac muscle cells are different than the skeletal muscle cells. The cardiac muscle cells are short and mononucleated, and they have that striated appearance that we can see there due to the abundant sarcomeres of actin and myosin filaments. And many contain mitochondria as well then as extensive sarcoplasmic reticulum. So that's how the book ties this all in there. Okay. Then the cardiac cells are linked together by the desmosomes, which is what they showed us on the video as well. These are clustered proteins in the patches that glue together the adjacent cells for coupling and the gap junctions, which are the pores made of the connexin protein subunits. So these pores are non-selective ion channels that permit this rapid movement and charges between the cells during action potential propagation along the thickness of the atrial and ventricular walls. Then the book wants to get into a little bit of talking about the myocardial cell membrane, the ion channels and transports. What I want to show here then is more of this video that we had talked about when we also talked about in the video when they're starting to talk about the ion channels and the transporters. The book talks about the electrical and mechanical events of cardiac rhythmic activation and pump function will depend on the specific ion channels and transporters and the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane. With all the other excitable cells, the myocardial cells have a high rate of active transport sodium potassium adenosine triphosphatase pathway that establishes and maintains the ionic gradient across the plasma membrane. Remember that sodium predominates in the extracellular fluid and potassium predominates in the intracellular fluid. So at rest, the membrane is most permeable to potassium, thus setting a resting membrane potential, which is a voltage different across the membrane, in which the intracellular potential is negative relative to the extracellular potential. When we talk about the voltage-gated ion channels that are selective for sodium, calcium, and potassium will shape their action potentials of the cardiac cells. So the calcium active transport pumps in our sarcoplasmic reticulum and the sarcolemma actively will transport calcium out of the cell and into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, respectively. Calcium is also removed from the cytoplasm by a secondary active transporter between the sodium-calcium exchange protein. The video talked about this. The ryanodine receptor of the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane is the calcium ion channel that links the calcium entry into the cell to additional calcium release into the cytoplasm to cause muscle contraction. The gap junctions between the adjacent cells are ion channels that allow rapid propagation of the action potentials between the myocardial cells. And so this is what it looks like for us in the book when it's showing us the sarcoplasmic reticulum here, those extra calcium channels here. The book doesn't get into as much of the T membranes idea, which I do think is an important thing to understand. So the video, let's go back to that here for a moment and listen to part of that again.
Another feature of cardiomyocytes are passageways called transverse tubules, or T-tubules. T-tubules are invaginations, or tunnels of the cardiomyocyte membrane that increase the surface area of the cardiomyocyte, and they look like the letter T, so it's easy to remember their name. One last important element to depolarization and contraction is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is an organelle that stores the intracellular calcium. When a depolarization wavefront hits a cardiomyocyte, a few calcium ions flow through gap junctions. Looking at the cell membrane, if a threshold membrane potential is reached, then sodium channels start to open up. If there's a depolarization, then calcium and sodium ions start to move across the cell membrane and into the cell. That's where the T-tubules play a key role by bringing calcium deep into the cell. Once this extracellular calcium gets inside, it binds to the ryanodine receptors on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which releases even more calcium into the cell, a process called calcium-induced calcium release. This process helps to activate two contractile proteins, actin and myosin, which are called myofilaments. Myosin is able to attach and pull actin with the help of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, to form cross bridges that result in shortening of the muscle fiber. Eventually, calcium ions are removed by ion transporters that rely on ATP or concentration gradients. Now that we understand how a cardiomyocyte contracts, we can look at the various factors that affect cardiomyocyte contractility. Contractility is directly related to the concentration of calcium within the cardiomyocyte, so any factors that increase intracellular calcium levels will increase cardiac contractility. Since calcium is stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, concentrations of calcium will vary with how much calcium there is intracellularly and how much calcium is stored within the sarcoplasmic reticulum that is available to be released. One of the main methods intracellular calcium can be changed is with the autonomic nervous system. The heart
Was a nice review for us, reviewing the contractility. The big difference between the book and this is that the osmosis talks about the T tubules, which I do think is an important concept for us to understand to really get the idea of how quickly the cardiac conduction works. And it makes sense to me that we would have to have more surface area to work with when we create those tubules. The book starts to talk about the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system kind of intermingled throughout the chapter. So let's listen to this rest of the video, and then we can tie it through when we finish the rest of part 1.
Is innervated by both parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic neurons have a positive inotropic effect, where positive means increase, and inotropic refers to contractility. So sympathetic stimulation increases cardiac contractility by releasing catecholamines like norepinephrine, which bind to beta-1 receptors on cardiomyocytes. Activation of the beta-1 receptors leads to downstream phosphorylation of proteins like sarcolemmal calcium channels on the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane, which increases the sarcoplasmic reticulum's ability to release calcium. Phosphorylation of phospholambin, a protein found on the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane, regulates calcium ATPase, a calcium pump which transports calcium from the cytoplasm into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When phosphorylated, these calcium pumps become activated, which increases the amount of calcium brought back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, resulting in greater uptake and storage. This increases calcium stores for subsequent depolarizations. Finally, phosphorylation of plasma membrane L-type calcium channels will increase their permeability to calcium, allowing increased amounts of extracellular calcium entry into the cardiomyocyte. On the other hand, parasympathetic stimulation has a negative inotropic effect, so it decreases contractility, mainly due to acetylcholine activating muscarinic M2 receptors on cardiomyocytes. This leads to a downstream cascade of intracellular events that ends with inhibition of calcium channels. With less working calcium channels, there is less calcium moving into the cell and less calcium released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, leading to decreased contractility. In addition, parasympathetic stimulation also acts on the sinoatrial node, decreasing heart rate. Heart rate itself can also independently change contractility. For example, with a higher heart rate, there are more action potentials per unit of time, and each action potential's inward calcium influx results in an increase in the total calcium that enters the cell. With greater amounts of calcium entering the cell, the sarcoplasmic reticulum also accumulates more calcium for subsequent action potentials. Additionally, if the increase in heart rate is due to sympathetic stimulation, phosphorylation of phospholambin and sarcolemmal calcium channels increases release, uptake, and storage of calcium within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This can be seen graphically as the positive staircase effect, where an increase in heart rate is shown to increase inotropy gradually at first, as calcium is not yet accumulated. But with each successive beat, more calcium is available for the sarcoplasmic reticulum, with a corresponding increase in inotropy until finally a maximum storage level is reached and maximum inotropy is seen. This effect can also be seen in post-extrasystolic potentiation phenomenon. Post-extrasystolic means following an additional premature heartbeat, so a heartbeat that is not commanded by the sinoatrial node for whatever reason. This premature beat has a less than normal strength of contraction, as the ryanodine receptors on the sarcoplasmic reticulum have a transient refractory period at this point, causing a transient decrease in calcium within the cardiomyocyte. After this premature beat, sarcoplasmic calcium load is increased, as this premature beat did not allow the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium from the last two beats, and all of the calcium that's built up gets released together, resulting in an increased contraction. Sometimes that increased forceful contraction can be felt by those who are experiencing an extrasystolic beat. Another way intracellular calcium can be increased is with a class of drugs called glycosides. They are extracted from the foxglove plant Digitalis purpurea. The most commonly used glycoside is digoxin, and
we will cover this a lot more in pharmacology, but I'm going to let us listen to it here so we can have that understanding of it.
Works by inhibiting the sodium-potassium ATPase located in the cell membrane of the cardiomyocyte by binding to the extracellular potassium binding site. Normally, the sodium-potassium ATPase will pump out 3 sodiums for every 2 potassiums that it pumps in, with the help of 1 ATP. When sodium-potassium ATPase is inhibited, less sodium is pumped out of the cell, which builds up the intracellular sodium concentration and decreases the sodium gradient across the cell membrane. This decrease in the sodium gradient affects the function of the calcium-sodium exchanger, which normally pumps 1 calcium out of the cell against its electrochemical gradient by using the energy from a sodium moving into the cell down its electrochemical gradient. Since less sodium is pumped out by the sodium-potassium ATPase, less calcium is able to be pumped out by the calcium-sodium exchanger. As a result, the intracellular calcium increases and inotropy increases. The main use of this class of drugs is for patients with congestive heart failure whose ventricles can't contract hard enough to pump enough blood into the body. So, this class of drug is used to stimulate contractility. All right, as a quick recap, cardiomyocyte contractility depends on intracellular calcium concentration. This concentration can be modified by autonomic nervous system input, where sympathetic activation increases contractility and parasympathetic activation decreases contractility. Contractility can also be increased independently by an increase in the heart rate. And finally, a class of drugs called glycosides, like digoxin, can be used by patients who need some extra help with contractility, like those with heart failure.
The next section in the book, so they talk a little bit about the action potential, the cardiac cell action potential. They go into a bit more detail, and let's talk about what they show us here. They talk about the rhythm conduction system in the heart, so a good review quickly here. The normal sinus rhythm means that it should start in the sinoatrial node, and you can see that it's going to depolarize into the left and the right atrium essentially at the same time. There is actually a slight delay in the length of the time it gets to the left atrium because of distance, but when we're looking at an EKG, it is such a brief part of a millisecond of time, it actually gets buried within the EKG. So we don't see anything different in the P wave. It should look the same to us here. Then both of these potentials are going to come back together and go into the AV node. And then they go through the AV node down into the bundle of His, the AV bundle of His across here, down into the right and left bundle branches, down into the Purkinje fibers, and complete that. And that is one cycle. We have the SA node and the AV node should have the pacemaker cells within this tissue here. However, all of our cardiac cells are considered non-pacemaker cells, and they do conduct, but they can also stimulate their own inotropy or stimulate their contractility with each of the individual cells. The book then goes into the cardiac cell action potentials and starts to talk us through, as you can see, the different phases of the action potential. And this is really when we get into electrophysiology. I find it interesting that the book goes into electrophysiology first before we get into other concepts, but that's how the book does it. So let's jump into this and talk about this a bit further. Box 10.1 of your book is a great illustration, or not illustration, table, if you will, that tells us the phases of the fast response action potential in our non-pacemaker cardiac cells. And so we talk about that there is a fast response action potential that is seen in the typical contractile cardiac muscle cells of the atrial and ventricular walls. And that's 99% of the cardiac muscle cells are these non-pacemaker cells. And those cells are designed for force generation by contraction. So the action potential triggers contraction, which they say is the excitation contraction coupling, and conduct waves of depolarization to neighboring cardiac cells via the gap junctions. And so these action potentials have these 5 different phases that they call 0 to 4. So there's actually 5 that are listed in box 10.1 and is a nice way for us to see what it is that we're showing. So this is trying to show us that when a cell is fired over a 200 millisecond, the action potential is moving through and showing us here. So we are going to skip over to our osmosis video again, and this explains this really well for us. There's a little bit of double information in some of these, but I think it's really helpful for us to hear it as many times as we can, because it's a lot of information to learn.
Action potentials are the really fast electrical changes that happen across the membrane of certain cells, and often propagates from one cell to an adjacent cell, and cells in the heart communicate this way. Now, that signal's got to start somewhere, so some of these cells, called pacemaker cells, have the responsibility of setting the rhythm and pace of the heartbeat.
The pacemaker cells are going to be the 1% of cells that exist in the SA node, and the AV node.
So they got this really important job, but they're a relatively tiny group, and make up only about 1% of the heart cells. But they're able to continually generate new action potentials that get conducted to the rest of the heart, or the other 99%. And so these are what tell the heart to pump. The cells that receive that signal are called myocytes, because they make up the myocardium, which is the muscular middle layer of the heart. Myocytes are also called contractile cells, because they contract to allow the heart to pump blood. Myocytes are different from skeletal muscle cells, though, which get their action potential signals directly from neurons. Now, let's focus on a single myocyte cell going through a single action potential. The action potential of a myocyte is broken into 5 phases. Often they're shown on a graph of membrane potential versus time. We're going to start with phase 4, because why not? In phase 4, or the resting phase, our little myocyte friend is at rest, hanging out with an overall charge or membrane potential of negative 90 millivolts. Now, the interesting thing is that it has gap junctions, which are openings between 2 myocytes. So when the myocyte's neighbor depolarizes, some ions, mainly calcium ions, start leaking through the gap junctions, and that makes the membrane potential go up to about negative 70 millivolts. Negative 70 millivolts is called the threshold potential, and it marks the start of phase 0. Phase 0 is known as the depolarization phase. Basically, some voltage-gated sodium channels open up when they sense that the membrane potential is negative 70 millivolts, and they allow sodium to rush into the cell, creating an inward current. This rapid influx of sodium causes the myocyte's membrane potential to go all the way up to plus 20 millivolts. Now, if only a few ions had leaked through from the neighboring cell, and the membrane potential didn't get to the threshold potential of negative 70 millivolts, then those voltage-gated channels wouldn't open, and there'd be no depolarization. Essentially, there's nothing in between, which is why that we say an action potential is an all or none process. Alright, so if the membrane potential rises above negative 70 millivolts, and keeps going all the way to plus 20 millivolts, the myocyte is depolarized, and we're in phase 1, which is called initial repolarization. At this point, the sodium channels close and the voltage-gated potassium channels sense that it's at about plus 20 millivolts, and they open, allowing potassium ions to leave the cell. those potassium ions have a positive charge, so the cell's membrane potential drops as this positive charge moves out. This is called an outward current because it's literally a current moving out of the cell. So the membrane potential starts to fall, and we can see that this creates a little notch on our graph. Shortly after this, though, the voltage-gated calcium channels open up, and that allows calcium ions into the cell. As calcium flows in, it brings with it a positive charge. That positive charge from the calcium ions flowing in counterbalances the positive charge from the potassium ions that are flowing out. So the membrane potential actually stays pretty stable, and this is called phase 2, or the plateau phase. This calcium is super important because it's this influx of calcium that ultimately gets the myocyte to contract, which is how the heart contracts. So phase 2 is what's responsible for the length of the action potential as well as the heartbeat itself. During phase 3, or repolarization, the calcium channels close, but the potassium channels stay open, resulting in a net outward positive current. At the same time, ion pumps start to move calcium ions out of the cell as well, and that causes the heart to relax. Eventually, the membrane potential gets back to negative 90 millivolts, and we start over with phase 4 again. Alright, as a quick recap. Cardiac myocytes receive action potentials, or rapid voltage changes, from pacemaker cells. In phase 4, the myocytes are at rest. In phase 0, sodium channels open up.
So when we're talking about these phases right now, we're talking about the 99% of the cardiac myocytes that are not pacemaker cells. Make sure we're understanding.
Changes from pacemaker cells. In phase 4, the myocytes are at rest. In phase 0, sodium channels open up and there's an influx of sodium ions that makes the myocyte depolarize. In phase 1, potassium channels open up, and there's an outflux of potassium ions that brings down the charge a little bit. In phase 2, calcium channels open up, and there's an influx of calcium ions, and that counterbalances the potassium ion outflux, so it's called the plateau phase. In phase 3, calcium channels close, but the potassium channels stay open. So there's an overall outflux of potassium ions that brings down the charge that repolarizes the myocyte. And then it enters the resting state again.
Okay, so let's go back then to our lecture by the text. And what they show is this image here, which is your guys' figure 10.8. And this is showing that fast response action potential, right? And this is what promotes the ability of contractility. And so this is how they explain it to us in the book. Phase 0 depends on the fast sodium channels, and we get that fast uptake, right, to the above here to the positive 20. Phase 2 is the L-type calcium channels allow calcium re-entry into that for the contraction. Remember, they're showing here is the K is when the K is exiting out, but then here's where the calcium comes back in. So there's a little bit of a delay, which is why we get the notch. The the potassium is leaving, and then the calcium is flooding back in, so we level off through 2. Phase 3, the potassium exit will repolarize. So we're going outside this, the myocyte is what they're showing us out here. So in 3, the potassium is exiting, and that's going to repolarize and give us our RP, which is our refractory period, which prevents repetitive action. So we have to have this period here of 4. So the RP starts here and causes us to go into phase 4, which is our resting membrane potential. And this is the greatest potassium permeability. So the book goes into quite a bit of discussion about our ventricular cell refractory period, and that is very important, and that will tie into a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of, especially when you get to the electrophysiology drugs. So antiarrhythmics, later in pharmacology, we definitely have to have an understanding of this. So let's go back into our videos here. So now we're going to talk about specifically the pacemaker cells, right? So we're not talking anymore about the regular 99% of the cardiac myocytes. We're talking now about those 1% of pacemaker cells that should live in the SA and the AV node.
Action potentials are the really fast electrical changes that happen across the membrane of certain cells, and often propagates from one cell to an adjacent cell, and cells in the heart communicate this way. Now, that signal's gotta start somewhere, so some of these cells, called pacemaker cells, have the responsibility of setting the rhythm and pace of the heartbeat. So they've got this really important job, but they're a relatively tiny group, and make up only about 1% of the heart cells. But they're able to continually generate new action potentials that get conducted to the rest of the heart, or the other 99%. And so these are what tell the heart to pump. Now, pacemaker cells can also listen to action potentials from other cells, which usually come from neighboring pacemaker cells. But if those signals don't come, then a pacemaker cell will simply launch its own, and that action potential will then spread around. This property of launching their own signals is called automaticity, and it's pretty easy to remember since it's got automatic right in it. So let's start out by mapping these pacemaker cells. The first clump of pacemaker cells is tucked up here in the corner of the right atrium, and it's called the sinoatrial node, which is sometimes just called the SA node. We've also got pacemaker cells in the internodal tracts between the nodes, as well as in the atrioventricular or AV node, the bundle of His, and the Purkinje fibers. And together this is called our electrical conduction system. Pacemaker cells are heart muscle cells, or cardiomyocytes, and they pick up the action potentials too, but that happens just a tiny bit more slowly. So we can think of these bands of pacemaker cells as highways that carry the action potential to its destination super fast. And then these muscle cells are like little side roads where it's a little slower. This is important because we want all of the myocytes to pick up that action potential and contract at about the same time. We can call this whole system a functional syncytium, which means that the mechanical, chemical, and electrical connections between these cells allow them to act as one unit in some ways. And it's the pacemaker cells that can make all this happen. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at the chemistry that gets the action potential moving. Action potentials are initiated by depolarization, which is the opposite of polarization. Polarization is when there's a higher negative charge inside the cell relative to outside the cell, and that difference in charge is called the membrane potential. So if the membrane potential is negative, the inside of the cell is more negative than the outside. If it's positive, the inside is more positive than the outside. And if it's 0 millivolts, then the inside and outside have the same charge. There's 0 millivolts of difference. Alright, so the key here is understanding how the membrane potential changes, and it all comes down to the movement of ions. Specifically 2 factors: which ion wants to move across the membrane and how permeable the membrane is to that ion. So depolarization is when ions move across the membrane and the membrane potential becomes less negative, or even slightly positive. You can kind of think of it like you have this one pessimistic negative cell that throws its hands up in a moment of positivity and joy. When one cell depolarizes enough, it can cause some ions to flow into neighboring cells and trigger them to depolarize as well. If one cell after another depolarizes, then there's a depolarization wave, which you can imagine looks a little like a wave moving through a crowd at a football stadium. And each one of these depolarization waves causes heart muscle contraction. So the rate at which depolarization waves ripple through the heart actually sets the heart rate. This means that if depolarization waves are going through about once per second, then your heart is beating once per second, or 60 times a minute. Now let's focus on a single pacemaker cell going through a single action potential. The action potential of both pacemaker cells and myocytes are broken into 5 phases, often shown on a graph of membrane potential versus time. And we're actually going to start with phase 4. Phase 4 is the pacemaker potential phase, and it starts when the pacemaker cell is just sort of hanging out with an overall charge or membrane potential of negative 65 millivolts. Pacemaker cells have ion channels called hyperpolarization activated cyclic nucleotide gated channels, or just HCN channels, on their surface. That's a lot to take in, but basically these HCN channels are like gates that open when the membrane potential gets really negative, like negative 65 millivolts. And they specifically let in just positively charged sodium ions. Now, an electric current is a flow of electric charge. So when these sodium ions rush into the cell, then it's a type of current. And scientists have given it the name funny current, which is a super weird name. Anyways, as those sodium ions flow through the HCN channels, in other words, as the cell becomes more permeable to sodium, the membrane potential starts to depolarize slowly, or drift upwards all the way to about negative 50 millivolts. Now, after phase 4 is phase 0, and this phase is known as the depolarization phase. even though the cell was slowly depolarizing in phase 4. Once the cell's membrane potential reaches about negative 50 millivolts, voltage-gated calcium channels start to open up, which allows calcium to flow into the cell. With sodium and calcium flowing into the cell, the membrane potential rises all the way up past 0 millivolts and into positive territory, peaking out at about plus 10 millivolts. This happens super fast, lasting only about 0.5 milliseconds. Those calcium channels stay open until it hits about the plus 10 millivolt mark, at which point they start to close. Once the cells hit plus 10 millivolts, we're in phase 3, or the repolarization phase. You'll notice that we skipped 1 and 2. Well, that's because pacemaker cells don't have a phase 1 or 2. They just go straight from depolarizing to repolarizing again. At this point, the potassium channels open up and calcium channels close up. So the only ion channels that stay open are the potassium channels, which allow potassium to leave the cell, and the HCN channels, which allow sodium to enter the cell. Since there are so many potassium ion channels relative to HCN channels, there's a net outward positive current, meaning that positively charged ions are leaving the cell faster than they're coming in. So the membrane potential goes down again, all the way back down to negative 65 millivolts, which means that one full heartbeat has taken place. And then this whole process starts over with phase 4 again. Alright, as a quick recap, pacemaker cells generate action potentials automatically. Each action potential spreads through the heart muscle cells in a process called a depolarization wave, and each depolarization wave leads to a single heartbeat. For pacemaker cells, there are 3 phases. Phase 4, which is the slow depolarization phase, phase 0, which is the rapid depolarization phase, and phase 3, which is repolarization.
That is helpful to understand then the difference between the 99% of the cardiac myocytes and then the pacemaker cells. Next, we're going to jump into the video then about excitability and refractory periods, and then we'll talk about what the book thinks about this too.
Cardiac excitability refers to the amount of inward current needed by myocytes, otherwise known as myocardial cells, which are the cells in the muscular middle layer of the heart, to depolarize or generate an action potential. Whether or not it depolarizes depends on if the voltage-gated sodium ion channels are excitable or not. A more excitable cell might have more of its sodium ion channels in the ready state. And even if there was a relatively weak current of ions flowing in, the cell might still easily depolarize. On the other hand, a less excitable cell might have most of its sodium ion channels inactivated, meaning they won't open in response to stimuli. And this is represented by this little ball being stuck in the opening. And maybe only a few of them are actually ready. And so this cell would need a strong current of ions to flow in before it depolarized. Alright, so let's say that this myocyte is from the ventricles. And this is a graph of membrane potential over time. First, a few positive ions like sodium and calcium travel through gap junctions and enter into the cell. And this raises the membrane potential to a threshold level, typically around negative 70 millivolts. At that point, the voltage-gated sodium channels open up, and lots of sodium ions rush into the cell, and this causes depolarization. Right after depolarizing at about plus 20 millivolts, the channels become inactivated, making those channels unavailable for another depolarization. After the upstroke, there's the plateau phase, and then as the cell repolarizes, the sodium channels start to recover, and even though they're closed, they're still excitable. And eventually all the channels recover and the cell repolarizes back to its resting state around negative 90 millivolts. During most of that action potential, the myocyte's unable to depolarize again, and this is called the absolute refractory period. In other words, during the absolute refractory period, pretty much all of the myocyte's sodium channels are inactivated. So even if a bunch of inward current comes from the neighboring cell, it literally cannot depolarize. Now, there are a ton of sodium channels on each myocyte, and each sodium channel operates independently, but overall most of them stay inactivated after the upstroke, through the plateau phase, and until the cell is repolarized to about negative 50 millivolts, at which point some channels start to recover, and this is the point when the cell would respond to a stimulus. Now, the way that the absolute refractory period is measured is that an electrophysiologist delivers a current to the myocardial cell, and in response it has an action potential. During that action potential, the electrophysiologist delivers multiple bursts of current to the cell at regular intervals. If a burst of current causes nothing to happen, then that means that the cell is still in the absolute refractory period. But if a burst of current causes the cell to depolarize, then that means that the cell has come out of the absolute refractory period. Since these bursts were given at regular intervals, we ended up landing just outside the absolute refractory period. It's possible, though, that the burst of current was given at the exact moment that the cell was emerging from its absolute refractory period, but it's probably more likely that the cell emerged from the absolute refractory period before we gave it that burst of current. Also, in some cases, the burst of current that's used isn't very strong, and as a result, the cell might not depolarize even though it's no longer in the absolute refractory period. So all that being said, when electrophysiologists are measuring the absolute refractory period, what they end up actually identifying is called the effective refractory period. Next comes the relative refractory period, which starts at the end of the absolute refractory period and goes until all those sodium channels are recovered. During this period, there's a mix of some of those sodium channels being recovered and available for another depolarization, and some not being ready. But that proportion of ready sodium channels increases over time. Therefore, a cell in the relative refractory period can depolarize, but it needs a bigger stimulus than normal. Finally, we've got the supranormal period, where supra means more than, and this is when the myocyte is more excitable than usual. The supranormal period starts when the membrane potential is negative 70 millivolts, and it keeps going until the membrane is fully repolarized back to negative 90 millivolts. At this point, the sodium ion channels have completely recovered, and the channels are closed but in the ready state again. In this case, it's more excitable because that membrane potential is actually closer to the threshold potential than it is at rest, so it's slightly easier for the cell to depolarize. Alright, as a quick recap. When the cell's at negative 90 millivolts, it's resting, and all the sodium channels are closed but ready to rock. Once the stimulus comes in, the channels open for a short period during the upstroke. The absolute refractory period is when the myocardial cell's sodium channels are inactivated, and it absolutely cannot depolarize in response to a burst of current. The effective refractory period is often used interchangeably with the absolute refractory period, and represents the practical limitations of trying to measure the absolute refractory period and is therefore a tiny bit longer. The relative refractory period is when some of the myocardial cell's sodium channels are open, and so the cell is able to depolarize in response to a larger than normal burst of current. After that comes the supranormal period, which is when the myocyte's sodium channels are all recovered and ready to depolarize, but the cell isn't fully repolarized yet and is therefore closer to threshold than when it's fully repolarized.
Helpful. I think that is going to help a lot when you read your book and your text about the ventricular cell refractory period. There's a lot of nuance here, a lot of details, and I think it can be very confusing. The book does not add too much more to what the osmosis videos do. They just explain it in a much more technical way, which is a lot of information. When you are reviewing this for quizzes or tests, I would really pay attention to the osmosis video and watch them in review as you need to, because I think for me, it's so much easier to understand than reading text. And like if I watch the video and read text, it makes more sense to me. It helps me to understand what the text is saying. I find the way that the osmosis video ties in their illustration with their description is super helpful. So the book, this is one of the figures from your book here that really wants to walk through the absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. And I think osmosis does a great job of sharing with us how those two are essentially pretty much the same thing. I think the take home from all this is the absolute importance of the phase 4 resting and period and the refractory period. We need to have that set of time where nothing's happening, and it's when things get triggered in the refractory period that we can get into a lot of doo-doo, so to speak, and get into a lot of arrhythmias. This is what I think the osmosis video explained great, very easily. We have this minimum threshold that we have to have in order for something to happen. Remember, this is showing us outside of the cell. Right now we're sodium heavy, the calcium gated, the T's and the L's, and then all of a sudden as we come through and we have the influx happen and we begin to have the calcium come out and we get this pacemaker action potential. So I think this is helpful to understand the differences, and I hope you do now after watching the osmosis videos. Then the book gets into these discussions here about the decreased rate of depolarization. And again, we talked about or listened to that in the osmosis video. What we can really take away here is that the effect of this is due to the parasympathetic nervous system activation or through the vagus nerve. Same thing, showing that same slide where the differences happen with the negative shift in the diastolic potential. So the sympathetic nervous system will increase our heart rate. We all know that. Norepinephrine is released from the sympathetic nerve terminals, and circulating epinephrine is released from the adrenal medulla, and that activates our beta-1 adrenergic receptors in our sinoatrial node. So if we were talking about a beta receptor, we know then that if we give beta blockers, we are slowing down or blocking this process. So typically, again, remember that when we're talking about sympathetic, we want our heart rate to rise. That means we are going to have norepinephrine released from our nerve terminals, and epinephrine is going to be released from the adrenal medulla to activate the beta-1 adrenergic receptors in the SA node. That in turn then leads to the activation of the CAMP, second messenger system, and protein kinase A, which is our PK. When we have the activated PKA, it has two primary effects. Remember the funny channel. It increases the activity of the funny channel, or the HCN, and thus it increases the slope of phase 4 depolarization and shortens the time to reach the threshold. And it increases the rate of opening of the L-type calcium channels responsible for the upstroke phase 0 of the action potential, which is what causes this negative shift in the threshold potential. So that's how it's speeding it up. I hope this is kind of making sense to you guys in the way that in the red, that's our intrinsic rate. And you can see there's a longer time frame. So in a minute, you would have less beats per minute. If I increase my sympathetic tone and stimulate the norepinephrine and epinephrine, it's going to come and activate the beta-1 receptor mediated cells that are going to then use the CAMP to activate the PKA, and this allows for the increased calcium permeability, lowers the threshold, and increases the slope of diastolic repolarization, and the heart rate increases. So at the end of the day, if you were to say, how does the sympathetic nervous system increase our heart rate? Like we know we always say, well, epinephrine or norepinephrine increases our heart rate. But how would we explain that technically? We could say it's the effect of those things that cause the beta-1 receptor mediated adrenergic receptors in the SA node to activate, which then in turn leads to the activation of the CAMP, which then in turn activates the PKA. Once the PKA is activated, it increases the funny channel activity and it increases the slope of phase 4, so it shortens the time to reach the threshold, and then that will result in the opening of the L-type calcium channels, which is responsible for the upstroke of the action potential, which will cause the negative shift. So you're going to get more beats per minute, thus you have an increased heart rate. This was explained very well in the osmosis videos of the cardiac action potential determines the conduction speed in the heart, right? So this has to work well. We have to have this wave of depolarization to proceed across from the SA node, which was pacemaker cells, through the cardiac cells, the typical non-pacemaker cells, then to the AV node pacemaker cells, and then go into the ventricles, which is the non-pacemaker cells, to give us a contraction of our ventricular myocytes, which leads to the lub-dub, right? The squeeze, the systole of our heart. I think this is useful in giving us a visual, if you will, of from the pacemaker cells of the SA node. The current passes through these transitional cells to the atrial contractile cells that have a very fast sodium upstroke, and the faster depolarization associated with that sodium channel activation is needed because it's more efficient for the rapid conduction that we need through the atrium and the ventricles, right? We know this is very fast. We're talking less than milliseconds. So we have to have a very efficient way to do that. And we do that through the fast conducting non-pacemaker cells because those are the ones that have the fast sodium upstroke. That's what this picture is trying to show with us here. The other part that your book makes sure that we have a paragraph on is to talk about the L-type calcium channels and understanding that they have multiple roles in the cardiovascular function. So we're tying together some concepts here in the book that wasn't really addressed within the osmosis videos. So what they want us to know is that when you are working with the voltage L-type calcium channels, so calcium channels, they play a role in both the cardiac action potential and the conduction system of the heart, but they also work within the vascular function of the heart. So in arterioles, the L-type calcium channels are found in the vascular smooth muscle. And so remember we talk about that, the vascular smooth muscle and their ability to be compliant and to have their elastic recoil is important in maintaining our basal vascular tone. In the heart, however, the L-type calcium channels are found both in contractile and non-pacemaker cells, or pacemaker and contractile cells. In the pacemaker cells of the SA and AV node, the L-type calcium channels are then responsible for the upstroke or phase 0 of the slow response action potential. In the SA node, the L-type calcium current contributes to heart rate and acceleration by lowering the threshold potential. In the AV node cells, the L-type calcium channels cause increased conduction speed. In contractile cardiac muscle cells, the L-type calcium channels are responsible for the plateau, which is phase 2, of the fast response action potential that is a vital step in excitation, contraction, coupling. Okay. An increase in the L-type calcium current in those cells causes a greater calcium release from our intracellular storage, and that causes increased contractility because we will get a stronger contraction. So the cardiac muscle L-type calcium channels are stimulated by beta-1 adrenergic receptor activation, resulting in an increased heart rate and an increased AV nodal conduction speed, which results in an increased contractility. So if I were to give a calcium channel blocking drug, right, then if it works against these gates, it's going to have an effect in the heart. So when we use calcium blocking drugs, which is our calcium channel blockers, right, our CCBs, we can have non-selective and then cardioselective. The cardioselective calcium channel blockers, think verapamil and diltiazem, we'll talk about this in patho. They preferentially block the L-type calcium channels in the cardiac smooth muscles. And so they can be helpful because they can lower your heart rate because they're blocking that. And then the AV node would also be blocked more, so they would decrease cardiac contractility as well. But that could be worrisome, so you have to use them cautiously in heart failure. The non-specific calcium channel blocking drugs, just to begin to tie this together, those are things like amlodipine. And we use those not for heart rate, right? We use those typically for blood pressure. So those calcium channel blocking drugs work in our vascular smooth muscle to preferentially block the L-type calcium channels in our arterioles, causing a decrease in our arterial tone and thus decrease in our vascular resistance. I don't want you to worry about memorizing these drugs necessarily, but I want you to have this seed planted now to understand later when you get into the drugs, when we're referring to what does a calcium channel blocker do, you've now learned the importance of that. If we block that calcium, the L-type calcium channels in our cardiac muscles or in our vascular smooth muscles, what would the consequences of that be? It could be very helpful if we need to decrease peripheral vascular resistance, or if we need to decrease our heart rate, right? So if someone is in an increased heart rate condition called AFib, oftentimes we give diltiazem. We're purposely trying to slow the heart rate by blocking the L-type calcium channels in the pacemaker and non-pacemaker cells. The next idea is that the book does kind of this one little brief section to talk about the EKG, and at least at this point. So I just want to talk about this. I think this is a really nice graphic illustration because it shows us what you're seeing in terms of what's going to make our EKG and where we're seeing our action potential as it shows on the screen. You know, an EKG is a single snapshot in time of what's happening with your electrical conduction system. But as you can see, the electrical conduction system doesn't lie on top of the heart. it lies within the heart and all of the heart structure, right? And the muscle walls of the heart. So by watching an EKG, yes, we can learn about the conduction of the heart, but we can infer from electrical changes whether or not we could actually find out about mechanical or structural changes. So there's no way for me to hook up an EKG, an electrical tracing, to specifically monitor for like valve pressures, etc. But what I can see in abnormalities of the rhythm tracing could be because of the electrical system. Yes, but also because the electrical system isn't working right because of an underlying structural problem or disease process. So I want to plug that in here when we're thinking about the electrical EKG strip that we see. Please remember that's a snapshot in time, and it's very important to understand what's going on there because you are seeing both you're seeing the direct result of the electrical current as it's showing us what the conduction system is doing, but then you are also seeing that could there be a change in the structural mechanics of the heart that is altering the conduction system to give us an clue and an inference of what could be happening outside of just it being an electrical problem, if that makes sense. So the EKG represents the summed electrical activity of the many non-pacemaker cells. The calcium-mediated action potentials of the SA and AV node are not detectable on the ECG monitoring. As the waves move across the SA and AV node, across the atria and then the ventricles, the shifting membrane potentials of many millions of cells will generate this voltage detectable at the surface of the body. The rapid sodium-mediated depolarization of the atrial non-pacemaker cells is detected first, noted as our P wave. The delay, or the PR interval, is reflective of the conduction delay at the AV node, which is then followed by the QRS complex, which is sodium-mediated as well, and that reflects the depolarization of the ventricular non-pacemaker cells. And then the T wave shows us the repolarization of the ventricular cells, and that's what our T wave is showing us. So I'm going to skip over and go back to the osmosis videos now to start talking a little bit about the EKG and understanding a bit about that so that when we look at the arrhythmia section that comes up next in your text, it'll make a little more sense as well. Before we jump into the EKG, there was one video that I do want us to watch. It's the cardiac excitation contraction coupling video, but it brings up a lot of interesting and really good to know points in here that the text is a little bit more difficult to understand later on. So let's watch this one now, and then we'll move into the electrical videos.
Cardiac excitation contraction coupling is the relationship between electrical signals in the form of action potentials and mechanical changes in the heart muscle cells, called cardiomyocytes, that causes them to contract. Let's start off by looking at the structure of a cardiomyocyte. Cardiomyocytes have branches, as well as intercalated discs along their edges which have small holes called gap junctions that allow ions to flow from one cardiomyocyte to the next. When a cardiomyocyte depolarizes, ions like calcium move from the cell into a neighboring cell, and these ions trigger depolarization to happen in that cell. This is what makes cardiomyocytes part of a functional syncytium. They're like a little community of cells intimately working together. In addition, cardiomyocytes stay physically attached to one another through proteins called desmosomes, which are like staples that hold the cell together when they're contracting. Another feature of cardiomyocytes are passageways called transverse tubules, or T-tubules. T-tubules are extensions of the outside environment. They increase the surface area of the cardiomyocyte and they look like the letter T, so it's relatively easy to remember their name. Think of a large walk-through aquarium. You can walk through those tunnels and look at the sea creatures all around you, but you're not in the water with them. Finally, there's the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is an organelle that stores intracellular calcium, the calcium that's sequestered inside the cell. When a depolarization wavefront hits a cardiomyocyte, a few calcium ions flow through gap junctions. And if a threshold membrane potential is reached, then sodium channels start to open up. If there's a depolarization, then ions start to move across the cell membrane, and that's where the T-tubules play a key role. During the part of the cardiomyocyte action potential when calcium ions flow into the cell, the presence of T-tubules helps bring calcium deep into the cell. Once this extracellular calcium gets inside, it binds to the ryanodine receptors on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which releases even more calcium into the cell, a process called calcium-induced calcium release. The calcium helps activate two contractile proteins, actin and myosin, which are called myofilaments, and are ultimately responsible for cell contraction. And that's the key moment when the chemical signal is converted into a mechanical signal. When calcium ions enter the cardiomyocyte, they bind to troponin C, which is attached to a long thin protein called tropomyosin. Tropomyosin is draped around yet another protein filament called actin, where it covers up binding sites, so that the actin can't be bound by myosin heads which are lurking nearby. This is kind of like a protective parent that doesn't want their child to go out on a date. Those calcium ions bind to troponin C, and that causes tropomyosin to slide off of the actin filament, exposing the actin binding sites. At that point, myosin heads bind to actin, and this forms a cross bridge. When the parent's away, the children will play. The myosin head pushes past the actin with a power stroke, effectively pulling the actin and myosin filaments past one another and shortening the muscle. The myosin does this a few times with actin, binding, sliding past, reattaching, and then repeating this process and using up ATP along the way. The myosin head looks kind of like an oar in a boat. It hits the water, shifts, then comes out, and this only works in the presence of calcium ions. Eventually, calcium ions are removed by ion transporters that rely on ATP or concentration gradients. Most of the calcium gets moved back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or the extracellular environment, and some also moves into the mitochondria. Once that calcium is gone, the troponin goes back to its original shape, which blocks the binding sites on the actin and prevents more cross bridges from forming. Alright, as a quick recap. Cardiac excitation-contraction coupling is when an action potential is converted into mechanical energy. Calcium ions move into the cell via T-tubules and bind to troponin. The troponin changes conformation and exposes more of the actin filament, which has binding sites for myosin. Myosin-actin bridges form using ATP and are part of the power stroke that pulls actin and myosin close together, forming the basis for muscle contraction.
I'm going to end this video here and try to keep them within an hour of each of the videos for this chapter to kind of take it in slower chunks. So find me again in lecture part 1, but video 2.